At 41 years old, Ada Witcom stood on the wooden steps of the Larkspur Gulch courthouse, with $4 in her pocket, a carpet bag of mended clothes at her feet, and nowhere in the world left to call home. It was her husband's own brother, Silas Witcom, who had cast her out, presenting a note before the county judge that bore Daniel's signature on a line Daniel had never signed, and it was the town's banker, Augustus Pruitt, who had smiled thinly and called the matter settled. All Ada had left after 5 years of widowhood and 18 years of marriage was what fit in that one bag, and $4 that would not keep her a week. So when the county auctioneer 2 days later offered the old abandoned telegraph office for whatever anyone would pay, and not a soul in Larkspur Gulch raised a hand, Ada Witcom walked forward in front of the whole watching town and said, in a voice steadier than she felt, that she would give $2 for it. It seemed the last foolish act of a woman with nothing left to lose. No one there, not even Ada, yet understood that behind its rusted walls lay letters sealed away for a quarter of a century. Letters that would not only save her, but would finally set right a wrong the whole town had been quietly living inside of for 25 years. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Ada Witcom. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten, the way that old telegraph office was forgotten, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We would love to know. Ada had not always been a woman with empty pockets. She had been born Ada Marrow in the spring of 1860 in a modest frame house behind the telegraph office of a rail town 2 counties east of Larkspur Gulch, and her earliest memories were not of dolls or gardens, but of the ticking, clicking, endlessly patient language her father spoke with his fingertips. Thomas Marrow had been a telegraph operator for 31 years, a quiet, careful man who believed that the wire running through his little office connected him to something larger than himself, not just to Denver and Chicago and the wide, unseen cities beyond the mountains, but to a kind of sacred trust. He used to tell his daughter when she was small enough to sit on the tall stool beside his desk with her feet dangling far above the floor, that every message that passed beneath his hand belonged, for the moment it traveled through him, to him alone, and that the whole of his worth as a man rested on whether he delivered it faithfully, word for word, to the person it was meant for. A telegraph key has no memory and no conscience, he told her. Those belong to the operator. It is not enough to hear the message. You must be the kind of person who can be trusted to pass it on exactly as it was given to you. Ada took this to heart the way other children take to heart a favorite hymn. By the age of 9, she could hear the dits and das coming down the wire and translate them faster than her father could write them, her small hand steadier than his on days when his eyes ached from squinting at the sounder. By 12, she was permitted to relieve him during slow afternoons, sitting alone in the little office with its smell of hot brass and lamp oil, feeling, for the first time in her young life, the particular pride of being needed for something real. She learned patience in that office. The patience of waiting through long silences for a line to clear, of sitting with an urgent message and knowing she could do nothing but wait for the right moment to send it. She learned discretion, because a telegraph operator hears everything a town does not yet know: births, deaths, bank failures, love affairs, all of it passing through her hands before it passed through anyone else's mouth. And her father taught her that the worst thing an operator could do, worse even than a missed transmission, was to speak of what she had read. And she learned, most of all, that value is not always announced. A dispatch that seemed like nothing, 3 plain words, a string of numbers, might be the very thing a man had been waiting his whole life to hear, and a person who could not see that was not fit to sit at the key. She married Daniel Witcom at 23, a broad-shouldered homesteader from Larkspur Gulch who had come east courting cattle and left, as he liked to say, having found something better. Daniel was not a clever man in the way her father had been clever, but he had a steadiness to him, a way of looking at a hard year of drought or a sick herd, and simply beginning the work of fixing it, rather than mourning what could not be helped, and Ada loved him for the plainness of his goodness. They built a small ranch together on the eastern edge of Larkspur Gulch, in the shadow of the Bitterroot foothills, and though they were never wealthy, they were, for 18 years, entirely content. Ada kept the books for the ranch with the same precision her father had taught her for the wire, every entry exact, every debt recorded and paid on time, and she became known around Larkspur Gulch as a woman whose word, once given, did not need to be checked twice. They had no children who lived past infancy, a grief the two of them carried quietly and never discussed with the town, and in its place they poured themselves into the land, into the small kindnesses of neighbors, into a marriage that people in Larkspur Gulch still spoke of, even after Daniel was gone, as a rare and settled thing. It was this life, earned, modest, and honest, that Ada Witcom was standing on the courthouse steps, having entirely lost, on the day our story truly begins. Daniel died in the winter of 1897, of a fever that came on hard after he spent 3 days searching a blizzard for stray cattle, and Ada nursed him through 11 days before the fever took him in the small hours of a Tuesday morning, with the wind still howling outside their bedroom window. She grieved the way steady people grieve, which is to say, quietly, and she kept the ranch running through that first terrible year almost entirely alone, because it was what Daniel would have done for her, and because the work itself was the only mercy available to a woman with no children to comfort, and no family of her own left living. It was in the second year of her widowhood that Silas Witcom began coming around more often than he ever had while his brother was alive. Silas was Daniel's elder brother by 6 years, a man who had left Larkspur Gulch as a young man to try his luck in the mining camps further north, and had come home 20 years later with nothing to show for it but debts, a persuasive tongue, and a deep, curdled resentment that his younger brother had quietly built the prosperous, respected life that Silas himself had always believed should have been his, by right of birth order. He began by offering to help Ada with the herd, then by suggesting she let him manage the accounts, since surely such things were a burden to a grieving widow, and Ada, out of respect for Daniel's blood if nothing else, allowed him more access to the ranch's affairs than her own instincts advised. It was Augustus Pruitt, owner of the Larkspur Gulch Trust and Savings Bank, and the holder of the modest mortgage Daniel had taken years before to expand the herd, who first produced, in the spring of 1901, a promissory note bearing what he swore under oath was Daniel Witcom's signature, transferring the deed of the ranch to Silas in the event of Daniel's death, in settlement of an old debt between the brothers that Ada had never once heard mentioned in 18 years of marriage. Ada knew her husband's hand as well as she knew her own, and she knew, looking at that signature, that it was wrong. The loop of the D was too narrow, the crossing of the T too hurried, the kind of forgery that would fool a stranger but never a wife. She said so, plainly, before Judge Wren Halloway in the Larkspur Gulch courthouse, and she watched the judge's face soften, with something like sympathy, and harden, just as quickly, with something like helplessness, because Augustus Pruitt held the mortgage papers, and Silas held the note, and Ada held only her certainty, which the law, it turned out, did not consider evidence. The judge ruled that the note stood absent proof of forgery, that a widow's word alone could not supply, and within a month, Ada Witcom had signed over the ranch she and Daniel had built together, packed the carpetbag that held what remained of her life, and walked away from the only home she had known for 18 years, past the general store where women who had once called her friend now found urgent business with their shelves rather than meet her eye, because in a town as small as Larkspur Gulch, siding against a banker who held half the county's paper was a luxury few could afford. She took a room above the livery for what little coin she had, and it was there, 2 days later, standing at the edge of a crowd gathered for the county's tax auction of abandoned properties, that she first laid eyes again on the old telegraph office. She had passed it 100 times without truly seeing it, a low brick building at the far end of the rail depot lot, its tin roof rusted through in 3 places, its front window boarded, its door hanging crooked on one hinge, the whole structure so entirely swallowed by weeds and neglect that most in Larkspur Gulch had forgotten it had ever been anything at all. It had stood empty since 1893, when the railroad built its new depot a half-mile east with its own modern telegraph line, and the old office, along with the operator who had run it for so many years, had simply been left behind, the way old things so often are, not because they had stopped being useful, but because something newer had come along to make them look small. The auctioneer read the lot number, called for bids on the 2 acres and the crumbling brick building upon it, and was met with silence. Not a hand raised, not a murmur, only the shuffling embarrassment of a town that did not want to be seen wanting something so plainly worthless. And it was in that silence that Ada Witcom heard, quite unbidden, her father's voice, patient and low, telling her that a thing which looks like nothing might be the very thing someone has been waiting a lifetime to receive. And she raised her hand and said $2, and the auctioneer, startled, brought down his gavel before anyone could think to laugh. She told herself, walking the half-mile out to the old lot with the deed folded in her coat pocket, that she had simply purchased shelter, 4 walls and a roof, however poor a roof, being better than the room above the livery she could not afford past the week. She told herself it was practicality and nothing more. But when she pushed open the crooked door and stepped for the first time in 8 years into the closed, dust-thick air of the old telegraph office, and saw the operator's desk still standing where some long-ago hand had left it, the brass sounder still bolted to its corner though thick with verdigris, she felt something in her chest tighten with a recognition that had nothing to do with practicality at all. It smelled, even after all those years of abandonment, faintly of hot brass and lamp oil, the very smell of her father's office from her childhood, and for a moment, Ada Witcom simply stood in the doorway and wept, not for the ranch she had lost, nor for Daniel, nor even entirely for herself, but for the strange mercy of finding, in the very depths of her ruin, a room that spoke the only language that had ever made her feel entirely herself. She spent that first week clearing the place with her own 2 hands, sweeping years of dust and mouse nest and fallen plaster from the floor, patching the worst of the roof with tin scraps traded from the blacksmith for a morning's mending work. And as she worked, she found herself talking to the room the way she had once talked to her father across his desk, narrating her small triumphs: a window freed of its swollen frame, a stove flue cleared of a bird's nest, to no one at all. It was on the 4th day, while she was scrubbing down the built-in shelving that lined the back wall where dispatch forms and codebooks had once been kept, that her cloth caught on a loose board at the base of the lowest shelf, a board that gave a fraction of an inch under her hand where the others held firm. She knelt, curious more than hopeful, and worked her fingers into the gap, and felt behind the board not the solid brick of the back wall, but empty space, a cavity built deliberately into the wall itself, and her heart began to beat with a slow, deliberate weight, because she understood, even before she had drawn anything out, that whoever had built that hollow space had built it to keep something hidden from the world. What she drew out, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and yellow with age, and tied with the same red twine her father had always used to bundle finished dispatches, was a bundle of perhaps 40 telegraph flimsies and a handful of folded letters, the whole parcel sealed at its center with a blob of wax pressed, she saw when she held it to the light, with the initial M, her father's initial. Ada sat down on the dusty floor of the office with the bundle in her lap and did not move for a long while, because she understood, in the particular way that only someone raised at a telegraph key could understand, that her father had not built that hiding place by accident, and had not filled it with anything he considered unimportant. Whatever Thomas Merrow had hidden behind that shelf, he had hidden it carefully and sealed it deliberately, and never once, in all the years Ada had known him, mentioned its existence to a living soul. She broke the wax seal with trembling hands and began, in the fading light of that first evening in her new and improbable home, to read. The earliest of the flimsies were dated 1876, the year Larkspur Gulch was still little more than a mining camp with ambitions of becoming a proper town, and they told, in the clipped, formal language of telegraphy, a story Ada had never once heard in all her years of living there. A group of investors out of Chicago, moved by a survey report promising rich bottomland if only water could be brought to it, had pledged $12,000 to fund an irrigation ditch for the fledgling settlement, the money to be wired in installments to a trust held locally by the town's telegraph operator on behalf of a citizens' cooperative that would oversee the ditch's construction and the fair distribution of water rights among the homesteading families who settled the valley. The operator named in every one of those early dispatches, the man entrusted to receive and hold and faithfully report the arrival of that money, was Josiah Pruitt, Augustus Pruitt's own father, and Thomas Merrow's predecessor, at the very desk where Ada now sat. The later telegrams, dated through 1877 and into the spring of 1878, told a darker story, though never in words that named the crime outright, because telegrams of that era rarely did. They told it instead through absence, through the plain arithmetic Ada's trained eye could not fail to see. A dispatch from the Chicago syndicate confirming the final installment of $4,000, wired and received, with instructions for the funds to be released to the newly formed Larkspur Cooperative Ditch Company for distribution among the founding homestead families according to the survey's original allotment. And then, folded separately inside a second, smaller packet, a letter in a shaking, elderly hand that Ada did not recognize, dated 1889 and addressed simply to whoever might one day find it, in which the writer identified himself as Ezra Doss, once a boy of 14, employed to sweep the telegraph office floor and run errands for Josiah Pruitt, and confessed that he had, as a frightened boy sworn to silence by a grown man he feared, watched Josiah Pruitt receive that final confirmation of funds, watched him quietly file it away, rather than post the public notice the cooperative charter required, and watched him, within the year, purchase under a separate name the very parcels of bottomland the ditch had been meant to irrigate, then found the Larkspur Gulch Trust and Savings Bank on the strength of that same capital, presenting himself ever after to the town as its most generous benefactor, rather than the man who had quietly stolen its future out from under it. The letter went on to say that Ezra Doss, grown now and ashamed of the silence he had kept as a frightened boy, had told the whole story to Thomas Merrow, the new telegraph operator who had taken over the office after old Josiah Pruitt's retirement, in the hope that Merrow, a man known through the county for his honesty, might find some way to set the matter right without ruining the many innocent lives that had, by then, grown up entwined with the Pruitt name, Josiah's own young son Augustus among them, a boy Merrow did not wish to see punished for his father's sins. Ada understood, reading the last of the letters in the dark of that first night, exactly why her father had chosen silence rather than exposure. He had no proof beyond an old man's confession and his own copies of dispatches that Josiah Pruitt could simply have denied ever existed, and a false accusation against the town's most powerful family, unproven, might have destroyed her father's reputation rather than Pruitt's. So Thomas Merrow had done the only thing his conscience would allow. He had preserved the truth, sealed it away behind the very shelves where he had once served the town faithfully, and waited, whether he knew it or not, for someone with the standing and the skill to one day finish what he could not. It took Ada 3 more days of careful reading, cross-referencing each flimsy against the ledger book she found in the desk's bottom drawer, her father's own meticulous log of dispatches sent and received across 19 years, before she understood the full shape of what she held. The dates matched, the routing codes matched, the amounts, entered in her father's careful hand in a column he had labeled simply Cooperative Ditch Fund, unreleased, added precisely to the $12,000 the Chicago syndicate had wired, down to the dollar. And she understood, with a clarity that made her hands go cold, that the Larkspur Gulch Trust and Savings Bank, the institution whose mortgage Augustus Pruitt had used, not 2 months before, to help strip her of her own home, had been built entirely upon money that had never belonged to Josiah Pruitt at all, but to the founding families of the town, families whose descendants still lived in Larkspur Gulch, still farmed dry bottomland that should, by every right recorded in that bundle of letters, have had water running through it for 25 years. She did not act rashly. She spent a full week gathering her courage and her thoughts before she walked into the offices of the county recorder, a mild, overworked man named Otis Crane, and asked, as calmly as she could manage, whether the original charter of the Larkspur Cooperative Ditch Company might still be on file. It was, buried and forgotten in a drawer of unresolved county business, exactly as her father's letters described it, complete with a list of founding homestead families still legally entitled, on paper at least, to shares of water rights that had never once been fulfilled. Otis Crane, to his credit, grew pale reading it, and pale further still when Ada laid beside it her father's ledger and the sealed bundle of original telegrams, and he told her, in a low voice, that she ought to be very careful indeed about who she showed this to next, because Augustus Pruitt's bank held paper on nearly every farm and business in the county, and a man who could ruin a town with a foreclosure notice could just as easily ruin the woman who threatened to unmake his fortune. Word travels fast in a town the size of Larkspur Gulch, and it was not 3 days before Augustus Pruitt himself appeared at the door of the old telegraph office, dressed in the same fine black coat he had worn the day he swore Silas Whitcomb's forged note was genuine, his smile just as thin and just as practiced. He did not shout or threaten, not at first. He was too careful a man for that. He complimented Ada on the industry she had shown fixing up what he called, with a faint curl of his lip, such a humble little property, and then he offered her, with the air of a man doing a great and generous favor, $400 for the deed to the office and its 2 acres, a sum so wildly beyond the value of a rusted building that Ada understood at once, with perfect clarity, exactly what he was truly offering to buy. She told him, as steadily as she had once told a judge that her husband's signature was forged, that the office was not for sale, and watched the smile leave his face entirely for the first time since she had known him. What followed was quieter than violence, but no less determined. Pruitt called in a note he held on the blacksmith who had been trading Ada roof repairs for mending work, forcing the man to withdraw his help. He let it be known, in the particular way of small-town power, that any merchant who extended credit to the widow at the old telegraph office might find their own accounts examined rather more closely than before. Silas Whitcomb, plainly acting on Pruitt's word, came to stand outside the office at dusk on 2 separate evenings, saying nothing, simply watching, in a manner meant to remind Ada how alone she was. And for a few dark days, alone in that little brick building, with the wind finding every gap in its rusted roof, Ada Witcom came closer than she ever admitted to anyone, even years later, to giving the whole matter up, to taking whatever sum Pruitt would still offer and disappearing to some county where no one knew her name. It was Ezra Doss himself who kept her from it. She had found him, following the trail of his old letter, still living on a small parcel outside town, a stooped man past 70 now, with clouded eyes, but a memory that had lost none of its sharpness for the shame he had carried 50 years. When Ada came to him with her father's bundle and asked, gently, whether he would be willing to say before a judge what he had once written in that confession, Ezra Doss wept for a long while at his own kitchen table, and then said that he had been waiting, without knowing it, his whole long life, for someone to finally ask him to tell the truth out loud. He was not the only one either. Once word reached the older families of the valley that the Merrow letters had surfaced, 3 more of the original Ditch Company's founding homesteaders, elderly now, but sharp of mind, came forward with their own half-remembered stories of a promised canal that had somehow, all those years ago, simply never come. The hearing was held before Judge Wren Halloway on a bright morning in the autumn of 1901, in the same courthouse where Ada had once stood and watched her ranch signed away, and this time the room was full nearly to its walls, because word of what the widow from the old telegraph office had found had by then traveled to every corner of the county. Ada laid out the evidence herself, in the plain, exact language her father had taught her at his desk 30 years before, the original dispatches from the Chicago Syndicate, her father's ledger cross-referenced line by line, the county's own forgotten charter naming the founding families still owed their water rights, and finally Ezra Doss, brought forward on the arm of his grandson, telling the courtroom in a thin but steady voice exactly what he had watched Josiah Pruitt do as a frightened boy of 14. Augustus Pruitt's lawyer objected that the telegrams could not be authenticated, and it was here that Ada's own hand-taught skill became the final unbreakable piece of proof, for she demonstrated before the entire courtroom the routing code and date stamp system her father had used throughout his career, a private notation system known to almost no one alive but the 2 of them, and showed how every flimsy in the bundle bore it correctly, in a manner no forger decades later could possibly have known to fake. Judge Holloway examined the evidence for the better part of an hour in silence while the courtroom waited, and when he finally spoke, he ruled that the charter of the Larkspur Gulch Trust and Savings Bank, founded as it was upon funds proven to belong to the Cooperative Ditch Company and its founding families, was subject to full restitution, the bank's assets to be placed under county receivership until every dollar, with a quarter-century of accrued value, was returned to its rightful purpose. It did not end, as such things rarely do, in dramatic ruin for Augustus Pruitt, but in something quieter and, we think, more fitting, a slow unwinding of the power he had built on a foundation that was never truly his. The bank was reorganized under new trustees drawn from the very homesteading families it had wronged, its assets redirected at last toward the long-delayed construction of the irrigation canal the town had been promised 25 years before, breaking ground that same spring under the survey lines Ada found still folded inside her father's ledger. Silas Whitcomb's forged note, examined under the same scrutiny that had undone Pruitt's bank, was declared fraudulent by the same court, and the deed to the ranch Ada had built with Daniel was restored to her name, though by then Ada had come to feel, somewhat to her own surprise, that her truest home had become the small brick office at the edge of the depot lot, and she leased the ranch instead to a young homesteading family, newly arrived in the valley, choosing to remain where her father's voice still seemed to linger in the walls. Augustus Pruitt did not go to prison, for the law found no clean way to punish a son for his father's theft, but he lost, in the span of a single autumn, every ounce of the quiet authority he had spent his life mistaking for respect, and he left Larkspur Gulch within the year, a diminished man in a town that no longer troubled to look up when he passed. And so it was that a woman who had stood on the courthouse steps with $4 silver and nothing else in the world came, within the space of a single season, to be the reason water finally ran through ditches that had waited 25 years to carry it. Ada Witcom had lost a ranch to a forged signature and a bank's cold arithmetic, and had been left, by every measure the town understood, with nothing of value at all, only a rusted, roofless building that no one else in Larkspur Gulch would spend so much as a single dollar to claim. But Ada had been raised by a man who taught her that worth is not always announced, that the most important message in the world can look, to an untrained eye, like 3 plain words worth nothing at all, and that the true measure of a person is not what they are given, but what they are willing to see in what everyone else has already thrown away. She had paid $2 for a building the whole town had judged worthless, and in it she had found not a fortune for herself, but the means to return, at long last, what had always belonged to everyone. We think of her still, some nights, sitting at that same brass sounder her father once worked, the roof mended now, the shelves rebuilt, the old office serving these days as the county's small archive and, some say, the most honest room in the whole of Larkspur Gulch. Ada never grew wealthy from what she found behind those shelves, and she never sought to. She kept only the office itself, and the ranch she chose to lease rather than live on, and the quiet, settled knowledge that her father's long patience, and her own, had finally been answered. That, we think, was always worth more to her than money, and it is, perhaps, worth more to us as well, in the telling. Thank you for spending this time with us, and with Ada Witcom. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked things, and overlooked people, often carry more worth than the world is willing to see at first glance. Before you go, we'd love to know, what is a time you found value in something, or someone, that everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.